The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a collaborative project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies and the International House Global Voices program. Our nationally recognized programming is made possible with support from listeners like you. Secure the future of World Beyond the Headlines programming by making your gift online at alumniservices.uchicago.edu/giving. Please specify World Beyond the Headlines as the area of giving. The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is supported by the McCormick Foundation, the Norman Wade Harris Fund, and generous contributions from listeners like you. Our speaker tonight is policy expert and activist Antonia Juhasz. A harsh critic of the previous administration, her first book was entitled The Bush Agenda, Invading the World, One Economy at a Time. And she's researched and written widely on international politics and policy, and especially on the perils of corporate-led globalization. Tonight, she will speak on topics from her new book, The Tyranny of Oil, the World's Most Powerful Industry, and What We Must Do to Stop It. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Antonia Juhasz.
All right, thank you all. Thank you for coming tonight. What an amazing night to be alive. What an amazing night to be in a group of people. Thank you for choosing a lecture and discussion over all of the many other draws on your attentions tonight. But as Evelyn said, this is precisely what now President Obama has said repeatedly today in his campaign for the past 2 years, is that this is about us and the actions that we do. It's about learning and service and activism. And you'll see from my talk, if you don't know it from my materials already, that what I am and what I have always been is a policy analyst activist. I see the two as very intimately connected. And I also, just by the way, began my professional career, or one of the gestations of my professional career, after studying public policy in both undergraduate and graduate school. I worked for the U.S. Congress, and I worked for Congressman John Conyers as a legislative assistant in his D.C. office, working very closely with the Congressional Black Caucus and the Progressive Caucuses in the U.S. Congress. And I know many of the members of Congress who today you could see crying from the stands and crying from the sidewalks, and I could feel that. I'm still feeling that, just the power of the moment of what today means in so many ways. And this may offend some people, but I'm going to say it anyway. One of the things that we all used to talk about was that the first African-American president was going to have to be a Colin Powell or a Condoleezza Rice, a conservative, someone who might not otherwise represent the ideals of the people who I was working in Congress with. And to have it maybe not be someone who might be as progressive as as some people might want him to be, including myself, but to have him be in essence a progressive and to be the first African-American president of the United States is truly amazing. And it's a wonderful moment to be giving a talk, and a little daunting of a moment actually to be giving a talk, I have to say, but wonderful to be here. I actually worked very, very hard to make sure that this book, and for the cameras to hold it up, The Tyranny of Oil, would get out prior to the election. I wanted to make sure that I was on the road during the election. So I worked very, very hard from the time of the completion of the Bush Agenda, which was 2 years ago, to the completion of this book. Coming out of writing the Bush Agenda, and in my work, it became so glaringly obvious to me that not just oil, not just energy, but oil corporations as an issue were so critical in understanding how the Bush administration came to be, what its power source was, what its objectives were, where it hoped to go in the future, and what that meant for all of us if we didn't understand it better, understand those actors better, understand those issues better, that I felt that I absolutely had to write this book and write it quickly. And I did. And while doing that, I was working just to make sure my organizations get their name out there with two organizations. One is a progressive think tank called the Institute for Policy Studies, which is based in D.C. The other is called Oil Change International, also based in D.C. And Oil Change has a wonderful one-line description, which also gives you a sense, if the title of my book didn't, of where I come from. And the one-line description is, we work to eliminate the economic and political impediments to shifting away from an oil-based economy. And I also felt it was critical to get on the road as quickly as possible and get this information out. So that's what I've been doing for a month preceding the election, then with the economic collapse, a month after the election, and now I'm somewhat essentially at the end of my formal tour, about 3 months of touring, with the inauguration of President Obama. So it's been quite a wild couple of years. And the title of my book, actually, The Tyranny of Oil, comes from a Barack Obama speech. It was from the Iowa caucus when he became the first African American to win the Iowa caucus. And he said in that speech, which was, remember back, gosh, how far back ago is that now? February of 2008, that he would be the president that once and for all ends the tyranny of oil. And then with the next breath, he said, and ends the war in Iraq, seeing the two as clearly intimately linked. And to me, watching, that was profound. For at that moment, it was only the most progressives of the progressives who were talking about these issues as linked within the presidential race. Of course, everyone and their brother knew that that's what it was about. And we had already had Alan Greenspan saying in his memoirs, of course, the war in Iraq is about oil. Everybody knows that, but nobody's saying it. We'd had General Abizad, the head of U.S. forces in Iraq, saying, of course, the war in Iraq is about oil. We simply can't deny that. Everyone in now mainstream Washington, D.C. had been saying this, but no political candidates outside of the most progressives had said it. And here was the man who won the Iowa caucus saying it. And the crowd, roared and was clearly with him. And to me, that was a fairly profound moment of change. And was the reason why I adopted that those words, which of course are also, it's such a graceful way of saying this concept. We've been tossing around titles for the book for quite some time, and I'm like, Barack Obama gave me the title of my book. This is an amazing wordsmith. Long before, of course, we had any idea that he would be the candidate. And even, in fact, at that point, it seemed quite likely that Hillary Clinton was still going to be the candidate for the Democrats for president. But so this was an issue that was early in his framework. And he also talked at that time, as did many other of the candidates, about corporate power. And it's interesting that Jim... Oh, God, I'm blanking on Jim's last name. Jim Schultz is speaking here next. I worked with Jim in Bolivia years and years ago on issues of corporate globalization and water privatization. Looking at resource wars have been issues that I have followed throughout my career. And the link of these issues around resources, corporations, and corporate globalization. And increasingly through the 2008 election, we saw candidate after candidate being called a populist. It started with Edwards. It then went to Obama. Kucinich had been called a populist way back in his career, so nobody needed to worry about calling him a populist at that point. And went to every single candidate, including the Republican candidates. So Sarah Palin was called a populist. John McCain said that he aspired to be a Theodore Roosevelt, a trust-busting president. This became the sort of call of this election. And that's not surprising to me because where we are in the United States right now is so remarkably similar to the period of history when populism emerged and the populist movement took place. And we have similar tyrants that we are confronting. So my book begins, not unpredictably, with the rise and fall of Standard Oil, the largest oil company in the world, the largest oil company in the United States, the largest corporation in the United States in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. The chapter in the book, however, is about Standard, but what it's more about is about the movement that arose among the U.S. population to confront Standard Oil and its ultimate, although short-lived, victory. I quote or describe a cartoon from this era, and I don't have the exact date, but I think it's about 1870. And it's a cartoon of the United States Senate. And the senators are seated, but towering above each of the seated senators and 10 times larger than them are grossly obese men in top hats and tails. And the men are identified, well, the men have different identification, but the only one that's identified by name is Standard Oil. And the men represent the corporations, or the trusts, which is what they were called, who had grown in dominance over the Congress. And this dominance had occurred following the U.S. Civil War. Corporations were allowed to merge, to grow, to gobble up competitors, to push out rivals, using any and all means necessary to grow to behemoth size. And within this picture, we have the corporate trust, and a big sign over the trust reads, "We are the Senate of the monopolists, by the monopolists, for the monopolists." And in a teeny tiny little sign off in the corner, above a little door, is a sign that reads, "People's Entrance." And the door is barred and locked with a closed sign over it. So the issue of the day was that corporations had risen in power over the government. And these are issues to which people responded in mass civil organizing and disruptions. This was an era where there were literally thousands of strikes every single year. There were people organizing all across class lines and ethnic lines, organizing to ultimately achieve the very first restrictions on corporate activity in U.S. history. So it was because of this era that we have these radical concepts like the 8-hour workday, the 40-hour work week, the right to unionize. The first campaign finance laws ever introduced came from this era, and antitrust law. And it's been said that if the Standard Oil Trust was called the Standard Oil Corporation, we would have anti-corporation laws in the United States. But because it was the Standard Oil Trust, we have antitrust law. And the purpose of the antitrust law, the Sherman Antitrust Act, was to break up Standard Oil. The idea being, and this is filled throughout the literature in the discussion of the Sherman Antitrust Act, was this very core concept of American democracy, which held at its heart that corporations should not be allowed to get so big that the government cannot regulate their activity, that corporations gain power over the government. And so the idea of the antitrust law was that, well, if they happen to get too big, we break them up. And Standard Oil, through organizing, through activism, through journalists, through lawmakers, through ultimately the U.S. Supreme Court, was broken up into 34 separate pieces. And then a problem happened. And this is a problem that Barack Obama would well appreciate today. Because after that victory and all of that organizing, essentially what happened was that the people then turned away and walked this way and said, okay, that job's done. Instead of doing what we have to do as participants in a democracy, which is to stay ever vigilant, which is to stay ever on top of the changes that we have sought to create. So, for example, if you elect a guy who you think is going to be a great president, you don't then turn away and say, okay, good job, go lead. You participate and you stay vigilant. And one of the things that happened when the people turned away and stopped staying vigilant was that, first of all, there was, and I won't go into the details here, I, of course, do it in the book, many problems with the way that the Standard Oil breakup was devised, the biggest one being that Standard Oil was given the job of devising the breakup itself. And mostly that there was not oversight. There was no government oversight to make sure that the pieces didn't come back together. And it began to come back together. But essentially what we've seen over the last 100 years is those pieces of Standard Oil slowly but surely, and most importantly as a result of a slow change in U.S. government policy begun most aggressively in the 1980s, to shift away from the idea of the government as the regulator, the overseer, the enforcer of laws, and to shift towards this concept of the self-regulating corporation. And if you read the words, which were fairly profound words to me, about 3 months ago, by Christopher Cox, who was the head of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, or is and will be for a few more days. Christopher Cox is one of those people who, when I worked for Congress, he was a member of Congress, and he was someone I didn't like very much. So let's just say that it was somewhat satisfying to have him, like so many others like him in government right now, have to come before people and say how much he was wrong. Because what he said was, what we have learned through the financial crisis, and this is the head of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, is that self-regulation of corporations does not work. We were wrong. Sorry. Oops. And it was satisfying to see him admit that, but of course heartbreaking and heart-wrenching and infuriating that it took what it took, this level of a collapse, to get the head of the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission to admit that they were wrong. Alan Greenspan has made similar statements, as have many, many others now, in sort of a long line of the people of that era admitting the folly of their ways. And then today, printed on this brand new White House website, which I'm someone, I don't know about you, who spent an awful lot of time on the last White House website. It was very exciting to see the new White House website come up. And of course, given the type of campaign that Barack Obama has led, it is no surprise that it happened immediately the moment of his swearing in. The new website was launched. But there's only 2 policy items front and center on that website, just 2. Does anyone have any guesses of what they might be? You know, because I asked you to print out the statements. You don't get to say. So no one's been there yet today? It wasn't the first thing you did? Wait a minute, what's wrong with you people? So the very first one is Barack Obama's agenda for energy and the environment. The number 2 is Barack Obama's agenda. Oh, wait. Yes, I'm sorry. The number 1 is Barack Obama's agenda for the economy. The number 2 is Barack Obama's agenda for energy and the environment. Those are the 2 policy statements that are up there. That's it. Which is fairly profound for me, given the work that I do, that this is a president who feels that those are the 2 most pressing issues to which he had to get statements up immediately. Now, if you continue to search through the website, there are more statements on all sorts of important issues. Don't think he's abandoning the issues that you care about, but those are the only 2 that are front and center. And in Obama's statement on the economy, he says this, talking about the financial crisis. We arrived at this point due to an era of profound irresponsibility that stretched from corporate boardrooms to the halls of power in Washington, D.C. For years, too many Wall Street executives made imprudent and dangerous decisions, seeking profits with too little regard for risk, too little regulatory scrutiny, and too little accountability. He then goes on to talk about what we can do that is right. But it is a critically important shift in what this means for policy making to have this be the statement by the incoming president of what is wrong. What we saw happen over 100 years was a shift in policy, most importantly begun in the 80s under Reagan, but then continued in the presidencies of both Bushes and Clinton, in this area in particular, in respect to oil companies in particular, and that was a dramatic shift in antitrust policy to say essentially it's no longer the concern of the U.S. government, the economic or political consequences of mergers. Most importantly, is not the concern, the political consequences of mergers. We will essentially only intercede in a merger, and in particular in the oil industry, because there were differences between the administrations and in other arenas. We will essentially only intercede if it looks like there's going to be an issue related to price of consumer goods, and that didn't even happen. But that's getting more specific than we need to, and that's in the book. What began in the 80s in particular was a process of mega mergers within this industry. And these are the mega mergers that have continued essentially unabated until today. And these are the mergers of the largest pieces of Standard Oil. So Exxon and Mobil were allowed to merge into one behemoth company. Chevron and Texaco merged. Texaco had already purchased Gulf Oil, and Texaco had already purchased Getty. We had we had Conoco and Phillips merge. We had BP buy Amoco and Arco. Shell bought other smaller Standard Oil pieces, and those are just the biggest companies. Since 1990, there have been over 2,600 mergers within the U.S. oil and gas industry alone, just since 1990, and just within the United States. And essentially what happened through those mergers was a mass consolidation of power within the industry. And that power sought to do a bunch of things, mostly to consolidate control of the resource itself. So since the mid-1970s, for a bunch of reasons which I go into in the book, we now have half as many refineries operating within the United States as we did in 1976. That can be very good for communities that live by the refineries, but not necessarily particularly good for the price of gasoline. We have also had a mass consolidation in gas stations. There are some 50,000 fewer gas stations now than there were in the mid-1980s. But of course, there are many, many more cars. Essentially, what we've seen pushed out are the independent companies, the companies that acted as the price outliers, the independent refineries, the independent gas stations. And we've seen a mass consolidation among the large oil companies. And that worked very well for a time. And of course, I will get to the drop in prices that we've recently experienced. That worked for quite a significant period of time to shift up the price of gasoline within the United States. And I want to say, very importantly, and we can definitely get into this if you want to in more detail, but and obviously, as you can tell from the beginning of this talk, I am a huge supporter of Barack Obama. However, I have many, many, many problems with his plans for the environment. Many plans with his problems with his plans for the industry. And I think that's fine. I think you can do both. You can support a candidate and have opposition to their policies. But one of the areas that I definitely have opposition to his policies is the idea of needing to increase domestic drilling for oil, because we have not faced, essentially ever, and certainly not during the period of the run-up in prices of oil or gasoline in the United States, a shortage of supply. That has never been our problem. In fact, we have been increasingly exporting oil and petroleum out of the United States. The rates began to increase in 2006 and continued unabated. And right now, of course, with the drop in demand, we are literally awash, completely awash in oil and gas. And that means sitting outside of the ground. That means oil and gas sitting in storage facilities, already drilled, sitting there, because the companies just can't get a good price for it. And they were sitting on it for a significant period of time, previously driving up the price. So our problem is not and has not been supply domestically. It has been the structure of our market. It has been consolidation in our market. It has been consumption. It has been pricing, and we can get into all of that. But a solution to our problems in no way, in my mind, lies in increased domestic drilling. But one of the biggest problems that the oil industry found was that if you look at the history of the industry, beginning essentially with the end of World War I until the mid-1970s, there were 7 giant oil corporations, and most of you are probably familiar with this. If you're not, though, there's a great book, you can read about it, that owned basically all of the world's oil. They were called the Seven Sisters. It was these were separate companies at the time: Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, Texaco, BP, Shell, and Total. Is that 7? And those companies owned basically the vast majority of the world's oil, and they set the price for oil. Now, in response to that control of oil and the pricing of oil, the oil-rich countries of the world stood up over the period of the 70s and into the mid-80s and nationalized the oil and took it from the oil companies and took control of their oil resource. And for a period of time, they organized as a group called the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, and they set the price for oil. Now, essentially, ever since the countries nationalized the oil, and particularly ever since the time that OPEC took over price control, the U.S. and British oil majors, and Total, which is French, and the U.S. government in particular, have sought to get the oil back and get the pricing control back. They succeeded in the second. They've so far failed in the first. Now, the first is getting control of the oil back. Believe me, they have tried, and they are trying, and they are trying, and they are trying. And as I write, I think extremely persuasively in Chapter 8 of my book, the war in Iraq, most certainly a war about oil, most certainly a war about gaining control of oil, but from the perspective of the Bush administration, I argue not necessarily a war at all about increasing the supply of oil to the United States, which for many years of U.S. history past, it was, I would argue, the position of U.S. presidents to gain control of Middle East oil to ensure a steady and cheap supply and flow of oil into the United States. I don't think that was the perspective of the Bush administration. I think what was more the perspective of the Bush administration was to open up and secure access to oil in Iraq and through Iraq to the broader Middle East for U.S. oil corporations, and through them also gain the political control, the hegemony, the regional control that control of oil gives you. There were certainly imperial aims to the administration, most certainly. But again, the imperial aim of having the control, of denying it to other leaders who might want it, of denying the power of the oil to those leaders, of denying the ability to give that oil to friends by those leaders and rather give it to friends ourselves, is still not necessarily about getting oil into the United States, right? What the war was about, more precisely, was ensuring that our enemies didn't have that power and that control, and I define enemies very broadly here, and ensuring access to control of oil for U.S. oil corporations. And the mechanism for doing that is going to be very important for us to understand as the Obama administration takes office, because, of course, Barack Obama announced, or he and both David Axelrod have announced recently in their public statements that one of the very first things that President Obama is going to do is begin the process of a 16-month withdrawal of U.S. combat troops. Now, that is important. It is profound. It is certainly a marked contrast from the last administration, but it is not, and it is in fact far from a complete withdrawal of the U.S. presence in Iraq. Far from that. So we're going to be dealing, no matter what, with a U.S. occupation of Iraq for a significant period of time to come. And we're going to have to be looking at the political issues surrounding it. And What the Bush administration and U.S. oil companies have been pursuing in Iraq and began to pursue well before the invasion was essentially the strategy for what does winning it mean. And one of the things that winning it means is the passage in Iraq of what's been called the Iraq Oil Law. And this is a law drafted largely by U.S. and British oil corporations, their representatives, and people from within the Bush administration, with a little help from the Iraqis tossed in for good measure, some Iraqis, which would very simply shift Iraq back, and essentially literally back. The same corporations in the same manner almost would have what they had before those pesky nationalizations of the 1970s. Iraq would shift from a nationalized oil industry, which is what it and most of the world has, to a privatized oil industry where oil corporations could gain between 20 and 35-year contracts for control over oil fields, production, decision-making. The way the contracts that we've seen look is that, again, the corporations would have 20 to 35-year contracts. They would not have to leave any oil in Iraq. They wouldn't have to partner with Iraqi oil corporations. They wouldn't have to hire Iraqi workers. They wouldn't have to share technology. They wouldn't have to share income. They wouldn't have to leave any money in Iraq, and they would have control over production, decision-making over their fields. This would be a starkly unprecedented shift within the Middle East, and has been something that Iraqis have been organizing against aggressively, which is why it hasn't happened yet, but something that the Bush administration was certainly dedicated to, something that U.S. oil corporations have been dedicated to, and will certainly remain on the table, I would likely foresee, until the last U.S. troops leave, because a document that was leaked by ABC News about 2 years ago, which was a U.S. study of passage of the oil law in Iraq, found that essentially if the oil law passed and U.S. oil corporations got to work in Iraq, they would need to be, quote, underwritten by the U.S. government. Now, I don't think that was referring to money. I think that was referring to troops. And essentially, if U.S. oil corporations took hold of oil in Iraq, the idea is that U.S. troops would have to stay there to maintain their security. And of course, as I go into also in the book, Iraq is a jumping off point to Iran. And again, Iran, very much an issue of hegemony and imperial control and denying power to enemies, et cetera, but also, depending on who's doing the calculating, the second or third largest oil reserves in the world. And it's actually quite possible that Iraq, some believe once Iraq is fully explored, Iraq may yet prove to have the largest oil reserves in the world, even larger than Saudi Arabia. But if you look at the military expansion of the Bush administration, the largest military expansion since the beginning of the Cold War in U.S. history, what you can see, and what I have done, is essentially that it maps out quite nicely along routes of where oil is found and where oil is transported. And this isn't just the Middle East. This also includes President Bush's inauguration of AFRICOM. So the United States has EUROCOM, which is the European Central Command military structure for the U.S. military. It has CENTCOM, which is the Central Asian Command, central command structure for the U.S. military. These are, of course, two areas where we have fought wars, right? Now we have brand new, thanks to the Bush administration, AFRICOM, the U.S. centralized military authority for the African continent. Now, what is different about Africa right now is the dramatically increased presence of U.S. oil corporations there and the significantly increased dependence of the United States on African oil. And I quote members of the U.S. military who say quite clearly, this is about protecting oil and the presence of U.S. oil corporations in Africa. These are all things that Barack Obama is going to have to undo, and it's going to be very difficult. It's much harder to undo a military structure, get rid of permanent military facilities that have been constructed and troops that have been deployed than it is to deploy them in the first place. And these are things that he's going to need us to be on top of and aware of and advocating around and for. And that's just in the military arena. So the corporations have been trying to get control of oil back. They haven't succeeded that well. So right now, the publicly traded oil corporations control about 13% of the world's oil, with ExxonMobil far ahead in the lead in that statistic, followed by BP, I believe, and then Shell. And these are all in the book, and I don't have them memorized. But about 13% of the world's oil. The OPEC countries control 40% of the world's oil, and the rest is controlled by China and Russia, a few other countries that don't tend to work together, don't tend to work in unison. And thus that means that for the first time in history, we live in a period of time in which no single bloc controls the majority of the world's oil and in turn sets price. The mechanisms that were put in place to essentially strip pricing authority from OPEC were threefold. One was increasing U.S. Pursuit of oil outside of OPEC. The second was trying to reduce our usage of oil, which is something we actually did for quite a period of time and were successful at. That was abandoned with the Reagan administration. The third was getting oil priced on the market. And this was the introduction of crude oil futures. Now, this is going to get a little technical, and I know that maybe we could actually open a door. I'm feeling like it's a little stuffy in here. I know we're all a little tired, but bear with me for a minute, because this is an important point of the book. It's going to be very important in moving into the Obama administration, and it is the linchpin to understanding what's happened with price. And there just so happens there's a lovely, very clear, very easy to follow chapter of this in the book. I struggled very hard to make it easy to understand. So if my quick version of it in the talk doesn't work, please read it in the chapter. But essentially what happened was that oil got put for the first time in 1980, gasoline in 81 and oil in 84 on futures markets. And a futures market is very simply a promise to purchase in the future a good priced in the present. That's all it means. You sign a contract that you'll purchase X amount of goods in X amount of time for a price set today. Now, it seems a very simple idea, but it gets a little convoluted. And the reason why it gets convoluted is that old pesky concept of greed and profit. And what has mostly happened with the history of futures markets is a history of corruption and price manipulation and different stabs and attempts at regulation. Today, futures markets are essentially not at all about literally buying a physical good. You don't literally trade oil on a futures market. You trade oil in private contracts, or you trade it on the spot market, where you're literally, so for example, Cushing, Oklahoma is the spot in the United States where physical oil changes hands. That's where the term the spot market comes from. You see a barrel of oil, you take a barrel of oil, you price it on the spot. Essentially, less than 1% of any goods literally trade hands on futures market. They're just about hedging, which I won't go into, and making profits. So essentially what happened was that oil got put on a futures market. And the oil corporations were okay with this because of what had happened with OPEC, but not really okay with it, and didn't really like the idea of their trades being made so public, such a public forum for the trading or pricing of their goods. And so they began a slow and very careful process, which really took root in 2000 to get the government out of the job of regulating oil and energy trades. So what happened was that the oil corporations teamed up with the nation's largest investment banks, and these names should sound very familiar and important to you: Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. Now, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley are two very important oil corporations to note. Freudian slip. Banks, investment banks, to understand right now, because they are, one, the only two investment banks to have thus far survived the crash, right? and the two banks that have most successfully begun the process of morphing into oil corporations. They own oil fields, they own pipelines, they own tankers. And most importantly, they own the futures exchange on which the majority of oil is traded. So in 2000, the investment banks, the oil corporations, and Enron teamed up to get the government out of the job of regulating oil futures. Now, Enron was key because Enron really knew how to work the government. And this was 2000. And the person they targeted was Phil Gramm. Now, Senator Phil Gramm from Texas was the largest recipient of oil corporation money at the time, continues in history to be the third largest recipient of oil corporation money. The number one all-time recipient, George W. Bush. The number two, Kay Bailey Hutchinson, the other senator from Texas. Number three, the other senator from Texas, Phil Gramm. Now, Phil Gramm was also the largest recipient of Enron money. And essentially what happened was a very, very important piece of legislation was slipped into a 1,600-page omnibus appropriations bill that was slipped into the last minute of the tail end of the outgoing Clinton administration after Bush and Cheney had been appointed president, but before president and vice president, but before, or another Freudian slip, but before they came into office, and slipped into that 1,600-page omnibus appropriations bill without discussion, without committee hearings, without anybody knowing about it, was a lovely little piece of legislation called the, oh my gosh, I've given this talk so many times I can't remember the name of the bill. It was a wonderful buildup though, wasn't it? Oh shoot. God, it's just not, okay, you really have to read the book. Sorry, folks online, because I've given this talk too many times. You know it's going to come to me in like 10 minutes, and so when I spurt it out, remember what it is that I'm talking about. A very important piece of legislation, and what it did was deregulate key energy futures trades, but also derivatives trading more broadly. Now, does anyone know what the result of the deregulation of derivatives trading contributed to? The subprime mortgage crisis, right? Nobody was looking over these derivatives trading. If you can point to one piece of legislation, and if you could name it, it would be this piece of legislation. So the first result of this deregulation was the California energy crisis. Now, is anyone else from California? Okay. In California, immediately following this deregulation, Enron set up Enron Online, its own trading facility to trade energy that because of this deregulation was completely unregulated by the U.S. government. California, in all of our wisdom, turned over our energy market to Enron. And I quote the Enron energy traders who say, yes, we manipulated price. Yes, what we did was illegal. Yes, what we did was immoral. But nobody knew about it, because we were doing it on unregulated exchanges. It didn't matter. We were kids in a playground without parental supervision. That's how they described themselves. And what they did was they intentionally moved electricity out of the California market. They intentionally pushed the price up. It skyrocketed. We had rolling blackouts of electricity in California. It was summer. There were schools that were hit. There were apartment buildings that were hit. People died. They literally didn't have electricity for blocks, periods of time. Our two public utilities went bankrupt. The state lost billions of dollars. Enron made millions and billions of dollars. And what we were told when we protested day in and day out, when we said something fishy's going on, we were told time and time again, it's supply and demand fundamentals. You silly Californians, nothing's happening. Until Enron imploded and the game was exposed. But I harp on this for a reason. The Enron energy traders live on. While the executives some were put in jail, some committed suicide, the traders live on. And they live on, thank you, pursuing the skills that they perfected with energy trades. And they live on and they work at BP, they work at Chevron, they work at Shell, and they are doing with oil what they did with energy. Because the other thing that happened in the year 2000, when Enron set up Enron Online, was that Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, BP, Shell, and Total set up their own crude oil futures market in Atlanta, completely unregulated by the U.S. government, to trade oil futures. 2000 is when it was set up. 2000 is the moment when the price of oil began to rise. But 2006 is when the price of oil skyrocketed. 2006 is a precise moment that the number of trades on the unregulated Intercontinental Exchange, the ICE, exceeded the number of trades on the New York Mercantile Exchange, the regulated exchange. And then they catapulted from that point on, and the prices catapulted from that point on. Now, we know that there is price manipulation that has taken place on the regulated ICE. We know it because it's regulated. We can only assume that there is manipulation that has been going on the unregulated ICE. I meant to say NYMEX if I didn't say that before, the regulated NYMEX, because of what's been the crazy gyrations that were happening with price. Now, essentially what happened, and this is why the price fell, and this is why this exchange has to be at a minimum regulated, and Barack Obama has pledged to regulate the ICE. But I would argue, and maybe Jim, you can ask Jim about this next week, and I encourage you to come back, because it's not just oil that's traded on futures exchanges, right? It's also food. And now there is a great deal of discussion about putting water on futures exchanges as well. And if we embrace a cap and trade system that includes a trading mechanism, we will begin trading in pollution futures as well. I think we need to think very seriously about whether these goods should be traded on futures exchanges at all, because the price was sent skyrocketing, right? And what happened when the price was sent skyrocketing, we have a lesson that we could have learned and should have learned from 1981, because 1981 was the last time, the only other time in world history, that the price of oil went to $100 a barrel. Now, that's adjusted for inflation, but it helps me make the point by saying $100 a barrel. Oil went to $100 a barrel. It went up that high because of intentional price manipulation. This was around the Iran oil embargo. There was intentional price manipulation that intentionally pushed the price to $100 a barrel. The result, because we have a world that is hardwired for oil use, was that economies couldn't afford oil, and they spent all their money on the oil they could afford, and they didn't have money left over to buy other goods from other economies like copper or corn or coffee. And there was a mass recession the world over. Demand collapsed. The price of oil collapsed. Developing countries were hit the hardest. They turned to the IMF and the World Bank. This is how they got into the debt loop of the IMF and the World Bank. They were just making their way out of that debt loop when what happened? The price of oil went to $100 a barrel at the beginning of 2008. The immediate result was the beginning of a global recession. That recession was then exploded due to the much broader subprime mortgage crisis, which then rolled over into further crises upon crises. But the price is what sent the recession beginning. The sell-off then became huge, right? The sell-off was as rapid and as unregulated and as unclear as was the purchase. And the price collapsed because demand collapsed and because traders were selling off rapidly their energy trades to cover their losses elsewhere. And the price collapsed. However, nothing else has changed, right? Our economies are still hardwired for oil. The deregulation is still in place, and the power of the industry is still in place. And the International Energy Agency just significantly increased the date at which it predicts that the world will hit the peak of oil production to 2020. So we're also dealing with a resource that, while we haven't not had enough yet, we will most certainly not have enough at some point in the future. The price is most certainly going to go back up. So in expectation of that, the oil industry, and the reason why I subtitle my book, The World's Most Powerful Industry, is a reflection of profit, and I'm equating profit with power. And the oil industry rose due to the industry couldn't get its hands on more of the world's oil, so it made the oil that it had worth a lot more money, right? And it took that money and became the most profitable industry ever in the history of the world, period. No comparison. It doesn't matter what you add up. I tried to add up everything. I did add up everything. I spent a lot of time doing it. It was a complete waste of time because there is no other comparison. There was only one other industry that remotely compared to the profits of the publicly traded oil and gas companies. No, not even oil and gas. I mean, they call themselves oil and gas, but they're oil companies. And the companies I'm talking about are the largest oil corporations operating in the United States: Exxon, Chevron, Conoco, BP, and Shell. The only industry that came close to their profits was the banking industry. And we know what's happened to the banking industry. So they're not really competitors any longer. And ExxonMobil, I think most of you are familiar with this statistic. Exxon earned the highest profits of any corporation in world history ever in 2003, right? Adjusted for inflation, period. They then topped them in 2004. They topped them in 2005. They topped them in 2006. They topped them in 2007. And they topped them in 2008. Exxon's just one example. The other corporations have all exceeded their own standards. Those companies are now sitting on vast stores of excess cash, such that the Wall Street Journal announced 2009, this is our new year, as the year of Exxon. Because Exxon, just that one company, has excess cash. This means cash it has not known what to do with. It has been a problem weighing on this company, has too much excess cash. $36 billion in excess cash. Guess what it can do with it now? Gobble up all the weaker companies that aren't going to survive the crash and further consolidate its power. But bizarrely, when I was looking at these numbers and I was thinking Exxon was going to start buying mid-sized companies, guess who they're talking about buying? Shell. It's astounding. It is astounding. They're the largest corporations on the planet ever. The idea of this consolidation is terrifying to me. And if they're floating Shell, it means that most likely they are looking, I hope they're not actually thinking about buying Shell, but maybe they are, but most likely they have their sights set on a host of smaller and mid-sized companies. And these are mergers we have to look out for. This is a power concentration we have to look out for. Because if you can say one thing for certain about the Bush administration is that it was bought and sold by oil. It was an oil administration. The industry was able to stop lobbying and start legislating within this administration. And what I list in the book are all the things that this administration has to undo simply to get us onto a sort of level playing field. What they have to undo from the last administration, so we can get started to achieve the vision that Obama has laid out, which is a vision that is about the United States being a leader on addressing climate. We cannot be a leader on addressing climate, and we cannot be a leader on addressing climate if we embrace the development of oil from shale rock in Utah or Colorado or Wyoming. We cannot be a leader on addressing climate change if we embrace offshore oil drilling. We cannot be a leader if we allow our companies to embrace tar sand production in Alberta. Period. These are the most environmentally destructive modes of oil production that we've yet come up with as a population, as a species. And we can't pursue them and address climate change at the same time. We have to. And if I could leave you with one task, to go to the new Obama White House website, where they do take in what people say. I hear the comments that have been put on the Obama website repeated by the mainstream press, repeated by the members of the administration, and they do it, I think, in a way that is quite honest. They get the sort of general gestalt. It is the things that they hear the most, and they are repeated. We don't know yet if they will be acted on, but they are certainly repeated. And one of the things that is utterly missing is a commitment to public transit, not just getting different kinds of cars on the road, not just fixing bridges and roads, not just making the world safer for automobiles, but a commitment to public transportation, energy efficient, clean energy public transit. Because the only way that we're going to do anything about the power of the oil industry ultimately, and climate change ultimately, at the end of the day, is for Americans to stop driving cars. We and our cars consume an enormous percentage of the world's oil. And it's a sort of, I think, silly, stupid thing to do. Why do it? We can do other things. Why destroy our planet when we could not drive cars? Hey. Now, to do that, and I think at the end of the day, we do have to have, certainly from this point, higher gasoline prices, higher oil prices. But we don't want to say at you to all the people who can't afford to come with us. That's why the investments in public transit have to go hand in hand with the increase in pricing for oil and gasoline so that people have a real alternative to driving their cars. And then we can lead by example through the rest of the world. Now, I propose many other policy shifts, ways of embracing alternatives. The words I would use to summarize what I think we have to be on the lookout for the Obama administration, and where I will end, are where I began 100 years ago with the populist movement. And that was the need to, and that is the need to, once again, re-embrace the idea, and Obama hints to it in his speech, of regulation, oversight, enforcement, and restriction. One of the things that the Bush administration did across the board was cut oversight, cut enforcement, cut laws, cut restrictions. And these are words and ideas that we have to re-embrace. We also have to, I think, very, very boldly and very loudly state, and this is something that one of the things that I thought was as interesting as watching the proceedings on television was watching the commercials. And I was extremely excited to see a commercial on MSNBC by Iraq Veterans Against the War. And if you don't know about Iraq Veterans Against the War and you didn't see the commercial on MSNBC, please check them out, because these are veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan war who have come back to fight diligently against these wars. And they have moved very aggressively into fighting head on the pursuit of the Iraq oil law and making very directly the link between the pursuit of U.S. oil corporations of oil in Iraq and the continuation of their required service in Iraq, and decided that they don't think that that's the way they should be having to spend their time. So if they're willing to take a stand on it, I think we should all have their backs as well. So I look forward to your questions. I am so thankful for you being here tonight. Please buy my book. I also have a website that's called the Tyranny of, it's just tyrannyofoil.org. It's the title of the book.org. I also have my other book out there, The Bush Agenda. And if you want to understand in particular the links between corporate globalization policy and the militarization policy of the Bush agenda, of the Bush administration, it's in that book, but also more specifically looking at the direct role of U.S. corporations within the invasion and occupation of Iraq. I do that in that book. So thank you all very, very much for having me, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Two excellent questions, and I'll repeat them. Tax on gasoline and nuclear power, and that just leads me to comment on, again, in terms of the commercials. The commercials really were fascinating, and one was a set of competing commercials. One was a commercial for clean coal that was by the clean coal industry that was just a commercial quoting Barack Obama on clean coal. This is a huge problem. There is no such thing as clean coal. There is no such thing as a concept of clean coal. Coal is by far the dirtiest fossil fuel we have. Please read more about clean coal, and please encourage Barack Obama to stop talking about it. But there was a competing commercial by a clearly equally large a coalition of environmental groups to combat the idea of clean coal. I definitely believe that we need a tax on gasoline. But I think, as I said, and the United States, by the way, has the second to lowest taxes on gasoline of any industrialized nation in the world. We essentially, have done whatever we can to try and keep the gasoline flowing. That became an issue of contention between the auto industry and the oil industry in the last several years, with the auto industry clamoring very, very strenuously to get the oil industry to reduce the price of gasoline to save it, and the oil industry saying, sorry. However, this is a big however, it has to be linked to a commitment to public transit. We experienced in this country what happens when people have to choose between giving their kids breakfast in the morning and getting to work. We have a country that is built on the automobile, and only a few of us are fortunate to live in cities where we have meaningful alternatives. I live in one. I've never owned a car in my life. I've never needed to. I've always lived in cities that have had excellent public transit, and that's a privilege that I've been able to do that. And I don't have children. Of course, it's much more difficult if you don't have children. And if you have children. And one of the things that's happening right now, and the reason why it's so crucial for the Obama administration to be addressing public transit head on, is that what's happening all across the United States is cities and states dramatically cutting their public transit budgets, right? Nobody has any money. They're having to find it somewhere. So what they're doing is increasing the price of public transportation and reducing service all across the country right now, just when we should be moving the other direction, right? So we're in this incredibly ridiculous dichotomous moment where we have an incoming president who's deeply committed to addressing climate and an economy that is essentially shifting the other direction. And we have to not just invest in wind and solar, but we have to invest in public transportation. Nuclear power. I believe that nuclear power is putting on the backs of our children and grandchildren a devastating effect so that we can live how we want to live now. And that what we have to do instead, and by we, I really mean the United States in particular, and by that lead by example, we have to reduce consumption of anything because all of the alternatives have their own consequences, right? Wind comes with consequences. Solar comes with consequences. Biofuels come with consequences. Cellulosic technology comes with consequences. We just simply can't replace the way we consume now with alternative energy and think everything's going to be fine. We have to use less. And that's okay. It's not that big of a deal, really, to use less than we use. And we gain so much by doing it. And I think the way that we talk about this with others is to talk about the gains we get by using less, the gains we get by reusing, the gains we get, and talk about it in positive language. If Barack Obama taught us anything, it's the power of positive language over negative language, and to embrace what he set out for us there.
Yes, you spoke implicitly about peak oil, but you haven't spoken explicitly about. I wonder if you'd address that topic.
Yeah, the reason why I don't is twofold. The first is I feel that too much of our movement has gotten obsessed with peak oil, and when it's going to be, how it's going to happen, what's going to happen. And this was very important when the concept needed to be proved. It's kind of similar to climate. And it's not so much climate. Never mind. But it can be a distraction. And the reason why I worry about it as a distraction is that we really don't know. Because one of the reasons why we don't know when it's going to happen and why the International Energy Agency prediction worries me is because what the oil industry comes back at us with, which is completely, utterly true, is that if we would just let them scour offshore, scour the shale regions, scour the tar sands regions, they will come up with a lot of oil. And they will. There is lots of oil there. If you don't care one iota for the environmental or social or political or economic costs, yeah, there's a lot of oil. So if we talk peak, it opens the door and has opened the door for them to say, hey, we got the answer. We got shale. We got tar sands. We got offshore. And there may, in fact, be trillions of barrels of oil in those areas. I don't know. They seem to think there is. It's quite possible. And so where I fall on this is that where we have to operate is from just the basic understanding that this is a non-renewable natural resource. It will run out. And the costs for obtaining it will grow in terms of military, in terms of the environment, in terms of the communities that live around oil and live around its refineries and live around gas stations, in terms of all the costs associated. And so what we have to do is operate from a premise that we have to get off it. There isn't a choice. We have to get off it. And let the experts continue to watch. We can't not watch. We can't not care. It's a huge issue. It's important. But I don't want all of us to get overwhelmed by it, which I think happens. And we get into fights. You say it's in 2010. I say it's in 2030. You say it's in 2040. And the world will change dramatically, of course. And we have to know about this. We have to be prepared about it. But I think the way to know about it and the way to be prepared about it is to say now it's a resource we have to get off of. It's going to run out. Is that? Yeah. I get in trouble with that with a lot of folks. So I think there's a couple terms that I've used of equal importance. Regulation, new laws, oversight, making sure the laws are upheld. What did I say? Oversight, monitoring, enforcement, making sure they're upheld. And then penalties for if they're not. What's the word for penalties? Somebody's got a good word. I don't have it. All of equal importance and necessity. And different. I agree.
Question about...
Oh, sorry. I didn't see her up there.
Okay.
Pull that down to your mouth.
Yeah. One of the things that you've said powerfully that I think we can all take home and work with is that we have a responsibility. And that if we come up with solutions as individuals and in small communities, we have the power to make a statement and the power to have ourselves an alternative to dependence on not only oil, but on renewable source resources that are not either sustainable in another way. And that, in fact, it is our making new choices and inventing new paradigms in our own lives and our communities that give us the power to help a change come about. And that is the only power that will really have a stance against big oil. Because if we don't need it, they're sunk. And so I'd like to kind of refer people to another resource that I'm sure you know about. And this is maybe the Post-Carbon Institute, Community Solutions, coming out of Yellow Springs, Ohio, and a book by Pat Murphy called Plan C, whereas Plan A is to continue as we are, Plan B being to go whole hog for renewable resources when in fact they're not a true solution, and Plan C is to change. And I think if we can take that home and work with it, we might have somewhere to go. One thing about public transport that is possible is that we don't, in fact, have the energy resources to revamp our systems. Certainly not, that's not going to happen quickly, and if we wait for them to do it, we're going to use those resources we want to move away from. The smart jitney idea that is now being promoted by Community Solutions is one to look into that could be implemented on a local level right away. Mm-hmm. And I think it's that type of solution that we need to think up and go forward with that holds hope.
Thank you. I think we have to do both as best we can, or appreciate that there are that we work in partnership with those that are doing the one and we do the other. And the both that I mean is work towards meaningful alternatives, use them ourselves in our own lives, work to see meaningful alternatives put to place in our communities. But we can't ignore, and if we can't do it ourselves, support others that are doing it. The corporate piece. And one of my criticisms of the amazing and powerful and spirited and particularly youthful climate justice movement is that it hasn't adopted as much of a corporate analysis as I would like to see, which is what are they doing that's wrong so that we can block them so that we can pursue what we want to do. It's right. Because unfortunately, time is of the essence. We don't have the luxury of letting them continue down a path that they would like to go on. The costs are too great, and the time is too short. And I'm afraid it's not as fun to say no, no, no as it is to say yes, yes, yes. Or maybe some people think it is. But sometimes I'm afraid sometimes we have to do both. And I'd like to see both. And so, but I also understand that we all don't have time to do everything. And one of the things we have to do as activists and concerned citizens and people who care is to look around and see who's doing the stuff that we care about that we don't have time to do and support them. And one of the things that I do in the back of the book where I go through alternatives is an attempt to cite all the different great organizations that I know about that are doing all kinds of great work so that you can connect with them, not to imagine that I'm proposing every idea that could ever come up, but rather that there's all sorts of great people thinking about all sorts of great ideas that we just need to be aware of and to highlight.
Some people have been suggesting that the manipulation of futures and some other derivatives has been largely because these trades have occurred since that act which you mentioned in 2000, and not on public exchanges, but rather by private individuals. So nobody really knows what's happening overall, right. And there can be no regulation if it's done privately rather than through a public exchange. So some people have been suggesting that what we need to do is to take all those commodities and other kind of derived instruments and place them on public exchanges. Mm-hmm. Do you think that if this were done for futures trading in oil, that this would eliminate the manipulation side?
No, I think, well, okay, I would say twofold. One, we need to get more of the trading onto exchanges if we're going to have futures trading in oil, yes. One of the big mysteries in oil, period, is all of the trading, whether it's in futures or spot, but more importantly, the private contracts between individuals and companies that we just know absolutely nothing about. If they're gonna go on to expose them, put them onto public exchanges and regulate the hell out of those exchanges, or take oil off of futures markets altogether and redefine how we trade and price and exchange the good. And there's lots of good ideas out there for doing that. I am not an expert in it. It's an area where we have to open our minds and pursue new possibilities. But at the end of the day, I want to quote, God, I forget his name. This is from the Bush Agenda. One of the Venezuelan co-founder of OPEC said at the inaugural OPEC event, we all have to remember, for all that we want to try and do in reining in our control of this resource, and this doesn't translate as well in English as it is in Spanish, but essentially he says we have to remember that oil is the devil's excrement. The devil's excrement. That it's a resource that is in many ways evil and tainted because of the inherent environmental abuse that comes from taking it out of the ground, but then a history of human rights and social and economic peril. And it's not the only resource that has that taint, but it has it, and we have to acknowledge that. There might not be a good way to trade it. There might not be a good way to produce it. There might not be a good way to consume it. There might not be a good way to refine it. And then to operate from there and say, how best can we do this while we try and move away from it. But I certainly think that he said it best with that quote. Yeah.
Is there anyone in the Obama administration that knows what you know and thinks what you think, or do you have the ear of people there?
No, I don't have the ear of people there. please send my book to people within the administration. Seriously, this is what people do, and it works. It is helpful. They do respond. I'm just learning as diligently and as quickly as I can who all the people are who are getting appointed. More importantly, who the people below the people are who are getting appointed. There are some good people in there. We'll see. I'm holding my, we don't know yet who these folks are and what they will do within this administration, because every person who's being appointed now has a history within past administrations, right? Constraints put upon them by other administrations that they've been a part of. The new head of EPA, is it Lisa Jackson? She's been deeply constrained by working under John Corzine in New Jersey, and it's been said repeatedly that once she is sort of freed from that, we'll see her in her true colors. This has certainly been said of Lawrence Summers and people who shaped their ideas of corporations and trade during the 8 years of the Clinton administration that were a very different time in world history. The movement against the World Bank and IMF developed during their reign, and the World Trade Organization. Governments were created during that time in direct response to those powers that resist those powers. IMF and the World Bank and the WTO couldn't be weaker now. The world is a different world. And so maybe those people are different people. And so we need to see. But not just we need to see, that's not what I mean. We need to shape. We need to be proactive. I think there's going to be a lot of good people in that administration. I think a lot of our friends are going to be in that administration. And we have to be proactive and engage in the working groups, engage in the website, engage with the people coming in with an open heart and an open mind and an open expectation that they're going to listen. Yeah. Do you think oil is a national security issue? Yes or no, and why? Yes, I think oil is a national security issue. But I think I define that in a different way than it's traditionally defined. I think we have put our national security at great peril in the pursuit of oil. We have made ourselves deeply hated throughout the world. There is no one outside of the United States who doubted for any period of time that the war in Iraq was about oil. Iraqis being pulled from the very beginning said in unprecedented numbers that this is a war about oil. We get it. We also like that we don't have Saddam Hussein. Now will you please leave? Oh, you're not leaving. Clearly, again, this is a war about oil. And that is such a callous reason for invasion. It's not the only reason. I don't claim it's the only reason. But it is a core reason. And the world gets it. We also have put our economy at great risk, and that is a national security issue by having an economy so dependent on this resource. Now, this is something that everyone agrees with, right? Now we have McCain, and we have Obama, and we have everybody else saying during the election, we have to get off of foreign sources of oil, and that's that's repeated throughout Obama's statements, foreign sources of oil. They do say that we can get off foreign sources of oil by turning more towards Canadian oil, which is sort of strange. The Canadians might not like that very much. What they're referring to is oil from the tar sands, and it's U.S. corporations that are taking the oil, and they're sending it all to the United States. Now, greater dependence on tar sand oil is just exchanging one form of death for another form of death. Being dependent on oil from Iran is problematic. Being dependent on oil from Canada is problematic in a different way. And our national security is constantly put at risk by our dependence to oil. And I would just take off the foreign on there. And I also don't, it's sort of weirdly sad that Obama continues to harp on Venezuela. But he does. Venezuelan oil he doesn't like either in particular. he can't be perfect. So that would be my answer. I think probably the very last question. Yeah. Oh, except for that young man. So we'll take those two very quickly, and I'll respond to them together, so you each get to talk.
Just a quick question. You contextualized at the beginning of your speech our current moment in history in terms of what happened with Standard Oil Company 100 years ago. If any of us look historically, we can look at the Magna Carta as a moment when there was a popular uprising against a tyrannical rule. And that's in the English tradition that we inherit as Americans as seed material for the Constitution as well. But as a subtitle for your book, it seems aiming right at the heart of corporations as an entity. What is your advice about how to bust up corporations? And what do you feel is necessary for that busting up to be maintained? Because although we can say we all have to be vigilant, we can see over the course of human history that there have been reprises continually where individuals have risen up against a centralized force in order to distribute that power more generally among the people who are really affected by it and who are ultimately the roots for that force to have any effect. What do you see at a policy level can be implemented, and how can human beings in our generations cooperatively participate in helping that policy mature into some kind of action?
I will answer this one before I take your question. And it's late, and it's a very big and a very important question. And let me just say, I've written 2 books on the topic, so it's hard for me to. That's essentially the heart of my 2 books. My books are activist books, they're policy books, and they're about corporations. So we have, which I am someone who came out of. Am a part of what we call the global justice movement, otherwise called as the anti-corporate globalization movement. And we have developed over this period of time, another book that I contributed to is a book called Alternatives to Economic Globalization, A Better World is Possible, where we set out a series of alternative economic policies. But in terms of corporate strategizing on the policy level, there are a host of things that we can do, but let me put them in the sort of most achievable, sort of minor. And let me say at the outset, I don't call for nationalization, although I do call for looking into nationalization, simply because for oil, I can't point to an example anywhere in the world of a government that's done it well. And that is inherent in the problem of oil as a resource. But it makes me very tentative about saying, and particularly while I was writing and George Bush was the president, that I wanted to hand over control of oil to a Bush administration was, an obscene concept to me. But it is something we have to look at as one of the, obviously the list of potential choices is greater nationalization. And now nationalization is, we know what everybody's doing. So if the Republicans can do it and George Bush can do it of the banks, then why can't we do it, of the oil industry? But there's many, many problems inherent in nationalization, particularly of a resource this valuable, this important. And while the United States, we hear a lot that we don't have a lot of oil, we actually have quite a bit of oil. It's just we don't have a lot of oil relative to how much we consume. And we have a lot of oil relative to the amount of financial and power that it would bring to any administration that owned and controlled it. And that's something we have to think very seriously about if we want to think about nationalizing it. We have to do a couple things to rein in the power of corporations. One is sort of basic things that we talk about a lot, right? Campaign finance reform is critical. We have to stave off the amount of money that corporations are able to contribute to elections. We have to address lobbying reform. We have to significantly decrease the amount of money that can be spent on lobbying the federal government. We have to increase taxation. We can't have one corporation that has $40 billion in cash after taxes is a problem in a democracy. We have to have enforcement because, of course, we know about the Cayman Islands and all of the money that the companies keep from being taxed. And we have to do this not just to reduce their power, but we have to do it to get more money into our economy, right? We're starved for cash. Why should they be sending money outside of the any economy? But I mean, and taxation is very important. For example, ExxonMobil's effective tax rate is something like 6.5%. I pay a 9.8 effective tax rate, right? Why do I pay a higher effective tax rate than ExxonMobil? That's insane. I don't have any money. Why do I pay more? We also have to look at things like corporate ownership of the media, which of course perpetuates corporate-friendly legislation. We have to look at consumptive behavior, and we have to regulate the activities of corporations. And I think we've figured that out. I think, when it finally gets down to, and this is the Federal Trade Commission, which is a topic that I go throughout the book, because the Federal Trade Commission deals with antitrust law, but it also deals with consumer protection. So this is an agency that has been stripped bare. There's a reason why we have contaminated peanut butter, contaminated lettuce, toys that we can't give to our children to play with, and the list goes on and on and on, right? And we have to look at trade, the rules of trade, and the rules of environmental protection, labor protection, and the rules by which we allow corporations to expand and to grow. Yeah, I can talk about this for hours, and we're at the end of the talk. So buy both my books. And again, I also list lots of great organizations that have active corporate campaigning. And I want to get this young man in because it'll be the very, very last question. You'll close us off.
What are the attitudes of politicians and members of Congress in general towards this issue? What are the feelings and goals? Why hasn't more already been done to help the issue?
It's a psychotic relationship. So a lot's been said, of course, around the issues of oil and energy and corporate power, but then there's no action. And the reason why there's no action is because at the end of the day, these companies wield so much financial and political power. It is exactly where we were with that cartoon that I started off with, precisely. That's the problem. Everyone gets it. I also go through in the book all of the propaganda of the oil industry and claiming that it's investing in alternative energy and therefore we should love them and we should give them our money and we should think that that means that the world is a better place because Exxon is investing in hybrid technology. They're not. It's all a lie. They're not investing. And everyone gets that they need to talk this talk, but at the end of the day, it's very hard to walk the walk. And this is why we have to know what are the constraints that the Obama administration is going to face in trying to implement the policies that we want to see implemented so that we can hold up the signs and be the ones that say, this is what's wrong to help him be able to push those things aside. And we couldn't be in a more, possible moment to do that than we are today. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you for being here.
The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a collaborative project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies and the International House Global Voices program. The World Beyond the Headlines series aims to bring scholars and journalists together to consider international news stories and how these stories are covered. As a listener, you have come to rely on this program for in-depth analysis of major issues facing our country and our world. But we can only continue our nationally recognized coverage with support from you. Secure the future of World Beyond the Headlines programming by making your gift online at alumniservices.uchicago.edu/giving. Please specify World Beyond the Headlines as the area of giving. The World Beyond the Headlines series is supported by the McCormick Foundation, the Norman Wade Harris Fund, and from generous contributions from listeners like you.